Marx and Engels drank in my local. Or did they? This pub is called The Crescent at the end of Chapel Street. It's been here for years. A place for people to meet, chat and solve the problems of the world. The story goes that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels drank here in the middle of the 19th century and talked about the new problems that were being created by the Industrial Revolution. This revolution was changing Britain from a rural economy where most people worked on farms in the countryside to an industrial one where most people worked in factories in cities and towns. People chose to drink beer because drinking water was often polluted. Salford grew quickly, and as the Industrial Revolution developed, factories were being built and the workers were needed to work in them. Life for these factory workers was hard and bleak. Factories were dangerous, and the working man's home was usually small and damp. Friedrich Engels wrote a world-famous book called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. It described the lives of people who came to drink here in the middle of the 19th century. Karl Marx also wrote a book, Das Kapital, which introduced the idea of communism, a political philosophy that changed the world forever. And the story was that these ideas started here, in this Salford pub. But did it?
The myth, I think, or possibly fact, we'll never quite know. But certainly the story is that this was one of the pubs, one of the many pubs I suspect, that Marx and Engels drank in. It's just one of those urban myths that's developed and now just taken on a life of its own, I think, on the internet. And most of the guidebooks and history resource trails now mention this pub as having been where Marx and Engels drank. Well, Engels came to Salford to work in the family firm of Ermin and Engels, which was founded by his father, also called Friedrich, and Peter Ermin, a Dutchman, and that was in Salford in Weest, and it was part of the cotton industry. In Salford he took the opportunity to study working conditions and living conditions, and clearly one of the places, if you want to find out what's really going on, certainly for men anyway, one of the places you would go to is a pub where people are unwinding and after a few beers will tell you the truth about their living and working conditions. So it would have been where Engels would have come during his research. Well, Manchester was important, I suppose, because it was the world's first industrial city, and therefore was viewed as a laboratory almost for social and economic and industrial working conditions, and therefore for Marx and Engels who were interested in society and how to change society, and it was an ideal place for Engels to live in and for Marx to often visit. And clearly it played a major role in the development of their theories of 19th century capitalism. I describe Marx and Engels' friendship as very strong. Eventually, when they first met, and they first met in 1842, when Engels was on his way from Germany to England, and Marx was the editor of a paper, the newspaper Rheinische Zeitung. And when they first met in Cologne, they didn't get on very well. Two young men vying intellectually, I suppose. But when they met again a couple of years later, and Engels had been writing for Marx's paper, then they got on very well and formed a lifelong friendship which stood the test of time. Well, Marx and Engels would have drunk in many pubs and taverns and gentlemen's clubs in Manchester and Salford, but with the advent of demolition and reconstruction of the city over the last 50 years, virtually all the pubs that would have been around in the 19th century have gone. One place you can definitely go to where they did study together is Chetham's Library near Victoria Station, and you can see the actual table they worked at, and you can see the books they studied, and this is one place in Manchester that had survived.
Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did actually meet to talk about these great new ideas in the library just down the road at the beginning of Chapel Street. Dating back to medieval times, this library was one of the few in Britain. People could come and read books and discuss their findings, long before Google and the internet were even thought of. World-changing ideas began here.
Well, we're in Chetham's Library, which is the oldest public library in the English-speaking world, and it's also the library that Karl Marx worked at in the 1840s. So it's really got two claims to fame. One is it's a very important library for scholars, for readers, and it's also important for people who are interested in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, because you can sit at the desk that they sat at and the library won't have changed at all since the time they were here. Well, they chose this library because it was apart from the British Museum in London where Marx worked almost every day, it was the only library in the country which would have books of interest to them. The library has probably about 100,000 volumes. About 60,000 are pre-1850, so it's a big rare books library in its own right. It has medieval manuscripts, it has sort of early modern printed books, some, the great classics. It has a huge amount of local material on the history of the northwest of England and Manchester in particular. On the whole, they're sort of classic economic history books. There's one, Eden, this one is The State of the Poor, a big, almost a sociological analysis of poverty in the country. There's others on beginnings of political economics, how you actually do economic theory. Some about the rights of women, or the rights of men even, political rights. We know that Marx was here working with Engels in the summer of 1845. We know from two sources. One is the notebooks that they left. They wrote notes about all the books that they read throughout their entire lives, and these have now been published. And in the summer of 1845, the notebooks refer to these books, the books that they read in the library. We know as well in the library because there's a letter, or a copy of a letter from Engels to Marx written much later in the 1870s, where Engels said, "I've revisited the library and I've sat at the four-sided desk, this desk in the alcove where we used to sit all those years ago." So he referred back to the time that they were here. There are a lot of people who come to see where Marx worked because it is one of these places where if you're sitting at the desk, you're sitting where Karl Marx actually read. Or if you look at these books, you're seeing the very books that he handled. And I think that we still have that sort of interest. There's always that sort of interest in Marx.
Well, over 150 years later, people are still coming to Chapel Street and to the Crescent to visit the place where these two men met, came up with ideas and changed the world. The rest is history.
Heritage Footsteps, preserving our heritage with new media.